with everybody. For instance, should we be more careful, strategic in how we do these things, etc. So I think that it's about, I think that the core of what I'm trying to say is that we have to make the most of what we have in a way that speaks to what our core national interest is, which it really is about how do we make a meaningful difference to some of our most important problems, such as inequality, the way that it's racialized, such as poverty, for instance, is all of these things, and that we should make sure that how we deal with these things are all made provision for in the budget. I think that is a kind of core thing, which requires much deeper negotiations, I think, not only between parties, but between the government and civil society, the government and the broader society, so that at least, in a kind of like basic level, there's a common understanding about where our tax rands go to, whether it's income tax, whether it's VAT, and all these things, and that these issues go to dealing with our most important pressing social problems, firstly, and two, in that the government has got, or call it South Africans, have got the exclusive jurisdiction of dealing with these things, so that when there are problems, there are local mechanisms of accountability, so that when we are going to cut money from one place to the other, it's not done as a result of what happens in other capitals, for example, but in relation to what happens here. I think that is a core thing.
Now, Prof, the World Bank recently released a report, Driving Inclusive Growth in South Africa. And in that report, they're warning of urgent need for public spending reforms. And they also state that the government spending has not contributed to economic growth and the reduction of poverty. So do you think that South Africa has the capacity to function, especially without this PEPFAR funding, considering the high number of people affected by HIV and AIDS, and how is this likely to impact on the budget speech that we're expecting the minister to deliver today?
I think that in the last 30 years, the South African government can be accused of having very good policies, very, very good ideas, but a basic inability to implement them, which relates to problems around the bureaucracy, and problems around how we manage public institutions in general, and thirdly, the way in which the government adequately responds to the demands put on by the population. I think those are the kind of key issues that we've had, which means that we don't have any shortage of good ideas, we don't have any shortage of people, we don't have any shortage of research. We just have serious chronic problems in the way in which our state institutions are set up and what they actually do. And what I mean by this, therefore, is that what one may find is that the budget may in fact be a good budget. It may be one, in fact, that is able to respond to the moment that we find ourselves in, right? Which is a GNU, so it's no longer an ANC government. It may well be able to respond to the current international moment, in the sense that we need to rein in, which means that we need to sort of take more responsibility to the things that in the past we've given to some of our partners, etc. And we can do all of those things. But for as long as we preside over government institutions that are not able to perform their very basic functions. And here we're not only looking at national government, right? I think that when we're looking at the budget, for example, we're looking at allocations. The next level, therefore, is that, well, then once that money has been allocated, what do government institutions, be it departments, be it all these things, what do they do with it? How do they spend that money? And I think that the chronic problems this government has had, successive ones, mind you, whether it was Mandela, it was Mbeki, it was Motlanthe, it was Zuma, Ramaphosa, etc., is that all of them have been plagued by the same problems. That is the basic inability to do what has been agreed to. And that talks to structural problems in the way in which our civil service has been organized. I think that we've seen glimpses of this when we look at things like, say, metros or how towns are run. If one drives from, say, Cape Town to PE, for example, or from PE to East London or East London to Durban, and you look at the general state of affairs of a lot of towns and small towns, etc., that gives you a very good idea into the window of how our bureaucracy works at a very basic level, which means, therefore, that the questions that we should be asking ourselves is not our ability to diagnose problems. That we can do very well. And I think that if we can look at the last budget speeches given over the last 25, 30 years, all of them have been good speeches. People have disagreed perhaps with maybe certain priorities, with maybe certain emphasis, etc. But I think that for the most part, the majority of them have been well received, which means that South Africans are very good at diagnosing problems. Um, what we fail to do chronically is to implement what has been agreed to, which means that we have failed to spend the money in the appropriate way that would make a meaningful difference to the lives of people. That's the problem that we have, and that's what we've got to deal with. And so, if I were to predict what will happen today, I don't think that we will see anything that will worry us. I think that the Treasury has been very good in terms of how it has identified what the central issues in the society are, or the central issues that need to be resolved in terms of where to spend our tax rands and all these things. I think that the problem lies in the layers just below the Treasury. And so the real kind of thing that we need to look for now is not so much what happens today, but in the next few months, how this money unrolls, how it is spent, how all the different departments propose to spend the money, and then how they actually do that. That's where the challenge is in this country.
Prof, just to move on, currently the citizens are nervous about the possible increase in the rate of VAT, which was reportedly the main reason also for the postponement of the budget speech last month. Now, who do you think is most likely to bear the burden should there be a VAT increase on today's budget speech? And what impact will that have on ordinary citizens? I'm asking this question, Prof, also noting that there has been some reports that speak to that VAT increase, dropping it from 2% to 0.75. But who will bear the burden? Should there be any percentage of VAT increase?
Look, the people who bear, or people who've borne the most cost in the post-apartheid period has been the middle class and the poorer people. They're the ones who have been the most affected negatively by the state of the economy generally, whether it's by rising taxes, that's the first thing, or whether it's by things like VAT, right? And I think that if we look at the amount of pressure that have been put on the middle classes in general, right? And this we can see in various forums, whether it's the level of debt, for example, or combined with the access to credit, or whether it's the rising cost of living, right? So now an ordinary shop, whether one goes to Pick and Pay or Checkers or wherever one goes, 30 years ago, what would come out of a shopping basket for say 200 Rand is very different for what comes out today, for example. And I think that always is something that affects ordinary people. Welfare people in this country can absorb it, but your middle classes and your poorer people can't absorb things like VAT increases, increased taxes, and all these things. And so they're the ones who will be most affected by it. I think that what's also made things worse is that salaries as a whole have not increased at the same rate as these things. And so therefore people might perhaps in one level have some kind of pay increase, but it doesn't correlate with other stuff, such as the fuel price and all these things. And so therefore, every year, your kind of middle classes and your poorer people are finding that they have less and less money in their pocket, generally speaking, and thus have to take out more debt to supplement for it. And so therefore, we in this kind of thing, scenario, if you like, where the consequence of all of the stuff is that the country has a very, very low saving culture, which is dangerous. Um, and I have yet to see any budget or any um, national policy that has problematized the ways in which um, uh, the middle classes in particular have been affected by these things. And I've yet to see them try to come up with solutions that would decrease the burdens placed on the middle classes. And so even, if we were to go beyond that, for example, and look at things like, when people say we need to finance NHI through rising taxes, what people don't realize is that wealthier people can absorb these taxes, right? The people who are going to get hit by the most are the middle classes. And so therefore the pressure is being brought to bear at that level. These are your professional classes, people who are key towards the daily economic activities of the country, are the ones who get penalized the most when it comes to these things. Yeah.
And Prof, we have a number of organizations in the country that sometimes hold the government to account, and amongst those is the Black Sash, which have accused the Minister of Finance of dislike. I'm saying dislike with inverted commas because that came from them. They've accused the Minister of Finance of dislike of SRD grants, which he was using to hold the country in ransom to increase VAT. And they've instead of the minister holding the SRD grants recommended a wealth tax adjustment, something they just spoke to earlier on now. What do you make of these proposals, and what are some of the expectations that you would have from the minister when he delivers the budget speech today?
Look, issues such as grants and wealth taxes and all these things don't solve the problem, right? So they might provide some kind of short-term cushion towards the ways in which macroeconomic pressures affect ordinary people, right? And I think that politicians like to use these things as some kind of indicator because it gives them some kind of tool to measure performance against when it comes to the next budget and the next budget and then the election, right? And so if you look at the way in which welfare regimes across the world operate in and of themselves, for example, is that they don't solve the problem. All they do is provide some kind of net where, if you were living, say, on the bread line, you now live one step away from the bread line, but you're still on the bread line, right? So you can have a grant, for example, but you're still living in a two-room house in the township, and you're still living sort of a hand to mouth with that grant. It doesn't solve the problem, right? What is so I find these kind of debates sort of circular, right? Because they don't really do anything. For the position of the minister, for them it's more of a political instrument that you use maybe in this context. But most importantly, they will use it as a way to measure their performance against when they have to, review their role with either the president or their party on the one hand, or when they will have to write up the next budget speech as a performance indicator to say, I've achieved X amount of grants or more people want grants, and that's seen as a good thing. The important thing here is employment, and the ability of people of working age to earn the kind of income in order to give them agency, and in order for them to make a living on their own, I think, and make the kind of choices as the law requires them to do, and all these things. And I think that if we are to measure or to say, well, then how then do these, or to what extent do these debates around the SRD grant or even the VAT increase, etc., how to what extent do they measure up against the provision of employment, and not any employment, by the way, not like a kind of expanded public works employment where you sit in the corner of the road and you wave a flag, etc. We're looking at when you actually have real earning potential in such a way that you're able to raise your children, you're able to raise families, have a house, create wealth for your kids, your grandkids, etc., that will deal with the structural contradictions My fear is that that debate is absent. And that's what I fear in all of these things. And that's what I fear when I hear people like the Black Sash or the minister, etc., in that they're not really dealing with some of the more core structural economic contradictions in our country, in that too few people work. And if too few people work, it means that a massive chunk of our population, irrespective of whether or not you have grants or no grants, or whether you increase VAT or not increase VAT, but if too few people work, that means that people don't earn an income. That means that, you can have as many grants as you want, right? But you don't give people the kind of agency that they can live their lives in a way that is good, and that should be expected. Um, and this is the kind of debate that we don't see. And that is where the danger is, in fact, in the sense that, grants, are good, fine. Grants can provide, a good safety net and all these things, but they don't solve the problem of poverty. They don't solve the problem of inequality, and they don't solve all the related issues or social issues that come with it.
Prof, with these issues, we can have this conversation the whole day. I'd like to thank you very much for taking time off your busy academic program to be with us at Parliament TV. And we hope that soon we'll have you physically here in the studio.
Yes, no problem. I look forward to that.
Thank you, Prof. That was Professor Zweletu Jolobe, an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town, providing some insight on the domestic and international political climate that South Africa finds itself in and possible measures of navigation. So as we count down to the budget speech, stay with us as we unpack more about the budget process, the role of advisory bodies, some insight and in-depth analysis from the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanchis, who will be joining us in a moment. Please stay tuned.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present a budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future. Processing of the budget is one of the most important oversight functions of Parliament. The budget reflects the choices that government has to make, and it is the tool it uses to achieve its economic and development goals. In the budget, government sets out what it's going to spend and the income it collects, which it needs to finance its expenditure. The government has to balance a wide range of legitimate demands with limited resources at its disposal. Budget oversight is intended to help government move forward to realize its goals by increasing government's accountability to its citizens. The budget process occurs over a period of about 18 months. The budget of any financial year undergoes a 4-stage process. The stages are drafting, planning and formulation, the legislative process, implementation, as well as auditing and assessment. Parliament and government departments plan the budget for months in advance for the following year, implementing the current budget while continuously monitoring it for delivery and compliance with policy, and evaluating and auditing the previous year's budget. During the legislative phase of the budget, the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, and the provincial legislatures debate budget votes with the involvement of interest groups and civil society, the media, and the general public. This is to ensure that they reflect national priorities and accommodate outcomes and actions required by the midterm strategic framework. It is important to measure the effectiveness of public spending and the manner in which public resources are spent. The more immediate goals are to ensure that government budget priorities are consistent with the declared policy objectives and that the financial resources allocated to priority areas are spent fully and properly. However, a larger purpose of the budget process is to contribute to democracy through ensuring openness, transparency, and accountability for public resources.
Welcome back to our live build-up to the 2025 budget speech here on Parliament TV, where we unpack the key themes, policies and economic priorities that will shape South Africa's financial trajectory for this coming year. Now, obviously, the nation is eagerly waiting for Minister Godongwana to address the nation, and it is crucial that we analyze and engage with the processes of Parliament around the budget and conversation with committee chairpersons and key budget advisory bodies to both government departments and Parliament.
And to provide the analysis and engagement that we need, we are joined by the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanjes, who has over 19 years of experience and is a recognized leader in African fiscal oversight arena across the African continent and beyond. Good afternoon, Dr. Yanjes, and thank you very much for being with us here at Parliament TV today.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And your office is always engaged with the committees, especially the committees on finance and appropriations. And recently, you've been tasked with preparing a brief to advise both the finance and appropriations committees about the implications of a possible VAT increase. Now, what are some of these implications that your office has identified?
Thank you for that. I think, look, what we did look at it was largely to try and provide Parliament with overarching analysis regarding the first budget of the term, to say, what would be the key priorities set out in the mid-term development plan through SONA, and how those priorities will be realized. We've got 3% growth target, we've got to deal with unemployment, deal with cost of living, deal with inequality, and also build the key of the state, some of the priorities. So our view is to say, where would that throw government into getting more revenue? And obviously we know the minister did say from last month, public media briefing, that they wanted to introduce a 2% increase in VAT, which is in effect 13.3%. Let's be clear, it's not a 2%, because it's 13% increase.
How is that, Doc?
Remember, now the VAT rate is 15%.
Yes.
Now increasing it by 17, it's by 2 percentage points divided by 15, which is 13%. So it really increased 13% of VAT. But then that was where the debate came from. That's why the Finance Committee says to look at this first, but also provide potential alternative areas where additional revenue could be identified. So that's what's really the crux of the paper, where we say, okay, we need to look at it in two ways. There's a revenue side of things, but more importantly also, is the expenditure side of things, where when you generate this revenue, what you're going to use it for, particularly where we want to drive growth, drive employment, and so on. So that's how, broadly, how we looked at it. What are the revenue potentials, and what are the expenditure areas that we want to spend that money? And we simulated it, or we modeled that to say, what does it mean for growth? What does it mean for employment? What does it mean for inequality? There's some of the key macro and social development indicators.
Which then takes us to the next question, Prof, because I wanted to speak on some of the revenue alternatives that your office has identified, especially in the brief that you produced for Parliament, and what are the potential implications for economic growth and fiscal stability for each one of those revenue alternatives?
Yes, thanks for that. I think what we did, we focused largely on the proposed 2% percentage point, and say, are there other areas that we could consider to get the same amount of money that was raised from there. And we did, in our simulation, we do show that if you increase from 15 to 17, would get you around 49 billion or so in the current year. But that could rise to almost 100 billion on condition that the money gets recycled back to the economy, because obviously it's a consumption tax. But then we looked at the debate about tax. It's always going to be in two-pronged, you know. Tax is a social instrument as well, as much as a revenue-raising instrument. And we thought about that aspect of, say, when we look at it from the social objective perspective, it might counter us if we want to address social objectives like we look about inequalities and some of the social indicators that we want to address. Then we said, let's decompose that to say who really pays VAT. And we looked at it in that way to say, in our simulation shows that actually 30% of the VAT comes from the two quintiles of population that the poorest pay 30% of that, and 50% of that is your of the VAT comes from the two top quintile, the rich. That's when we started decomposing from the social perspective to say, then when you impose VAT, it means 30% still come from for the poor, and the other part will come from the rich. Then that's why we started to look at alternative measures to say, I don't think that world government would want to embed in more the poor as well. And we looked at wealth tax. This was the next alternative measure to say, as part of our simulation, where else can you get that 48 billion of that food getting 2%? And we said, okay, in our simulation, it does show that when you impose 0.5% on the top two quintile rich wealth assets, you can still get the same amount of money which would have gotten when you use VAT. But also the second part to that is that you dealt with social aspect, which meant that you were dealing with inequality at the same time. And we also looked at other mechanisms, but those are some of the where we dwelt a lot by simulating those two instruments. And we said once you raise this 48 billion, then it means you have to recycle back to the economy by increasing social spending, increasing investment, increasing support for social wage or education, you have so many aspects. And that is likely to give you growth that you want, and creates more employment, and creates dealing with inequalities, but also dealing with some of the more social aspects of, so it's a very good mix back.
I had a chat just before this interview with Professor Jolo from UCT, who was also shared the same views that you are sharing, that with the increase of VAT, you're likely to see the people in the two quintiles, which is your poor and the middle class, suffering more than if you had to increase the wealth, like the wealth tax. So how does your office assess the visibility and the effectiveness of these different revenue options, especially with the tax increases?
I think for me, the paper also, what it does, it recognizes that Parliament is a very important space for our country, where the decision discussions happens here. We're proposing these views so that during public participation, during the time where public comes here, Parliament can facilitate the conversation whether to say which of these mechanisms we want as South Africans and which of these will be better off, and so on. And I think that's the first part to say. As in public interest context, you want Parliament to have all these options so that when people come to debate, these options are in place. But the issue of wealth tax, we need to decompose it quite a bit, which I'm not going to do now. I know we don't have a lot of time. But it's an issue of really saying, the debate to say we already have some elements of that in our tax system. When you think about, dividends tax, other tax. But I think in this instance, you're referring to looking at the assets of the two quintile, the rich. And obviously it means you have to design it because we've never had it. And what we say in the brief, we recognize the difficulties, complexity around that. And then the United Nations published a report a year ago, which advises on wealth tax, but recognize the complexity to how to deal with that. Hence, in our brief, we said maybe it's something that we want to work with it over a year or so, where we introduce it more permanently in a year's time, whereas we have immediate need for revenue. So in a way, there are possibilities there, but it means you have to do some work to get it more permanently introduced in the system.
Of course, Doug, I mean, I always say that the issue of tax is such a sensitive issue. Everybody holds on to their seats when you talk about tax because we're thinking it's more money out of our pockets some way or the other, whether it's direct or indirect. I just want to know whether your office has you explored any non-tax alternative measures then to ensure that there is an increase in revenue.
I mean, I'll take you back to my initial statement to say how we look at it in a way of this is the start of the term. We are coming with a low base as a country. We want to grow the economy, create employment. And to that extent, we always said there would have been a good argument for a need for additional revenue in that sense, you know. So that's what our commission said. There could have been a need for an additional revenue from that perspective where that's the first part. You probably need to have a permanent revenue mechanisms. But there are, when you listen to other colleagues, other areas which are also looking at paper, there probably are areas where you could have looked for pocket money for immediate need. But it even doesn't solve the permanent need for revenue. But again, the issue is to grow the economy. When you grow the economy, your tax instruments mean they can fetch more, collect more money than when it doesn't grow. Do you know what I mean? Even if, no matter how much taxes you can impose, if the economy is not growing, you're not going to get that revenue that you want. And the last point, I know there's been debate around the tax authority. You know, its ability to collect more does need support, and that's a big touch on that as well. So yeah, there are a variety of non-tax mechanisms that you could still use on a immediate sense, but probably on a long term, you need to discuss the more permanent mechanisms to raise more revenue. And I say growth, it's the first one. Secondly, it's to look at which taxes you want to, particularly that are less burdensome to the low-income households.
And Prof, Doc, I'm sure that brief makes some key recommendations, especially when it comes to tax compliance and the improvement of public financial management. Can you take us through some of those recommendations that you're making on the brief?
Regarding the compliance with look, I think the main issue would obviously be, you know, when budget is proposed, what is the process of considering it within Parliament, and that's probably when it triggers your regulatory framework in that regard, you know. But I think we focus a lot on ensuring that, you know, when the tax is introduced or when whatever mechanisms, there has to be a clear sense where Parliament can oversee that process or can monitor that process. Otherwise, you know, that becomes a point of not generating more revenue than we require. Because in 2018, we've had a VAT increase then, and there was a focus of revenue to be created then. And we now went back to say, did we really raise that revenue? And that, for me, the monetary mechanisms we try to talk about is very key for Parliament, at least, in that regard.
The conversation continues, but for now, let's look at the importance of oversight.
In terms of the Constitution, government is accountable to Parliament. Parliament, as the representative of the people, monitors and seeks to influence government policy and action through the budget. The budget is the instrument for translating policies and plans into public goods and services. Any policy or plan without a budget attached to it is unlikely to be successfully implemented. Economic success depends on the ability of government to employ limited resources with maximum effect. The role of Parliament in this regard cannot be overstated. Parliament's duty is to detect and prevent abuse, prevent illegal and unconstitutional budgetary conduct on the part of the government, make government budgetary operations more transparent, and hold the government answerable on how taxpayers' money is spent. Parliament exercises its oversight through various portfolio committees that assess the budget and other plans, as well as the performance of each department, including their financial performance, and hold them accountable. The budget process is crucial to good governance because it ensures that government expenditure remains aligned to South Africa's policy goals and objectives. What is also of great importance is that ongoing monitoring and tracking of the executive by Parliament allows for intervention in the event of wrongful expenditure and failures in service delivery. The process holds government departments accountable for their expenditure and gives Parliament and the citizens it represents an opportunity to make their own demands and interventions. Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
You will have to speak to issues which are in the National Development Plan 2030, critical issues of unemployment. How is government going to deal with the issue of youth unemployment? Because we have got so many young people who are not working. On top of that, the economy can't even be able to absorb the young graduates. So this is a problem. And government has to do something about it, working together with the private sector. And then we also have to look as to how has SARS, which is dealing with revenue collection, managed to collect revenue to an extent that we still have challenges, because now we have got deficit. Deficit in the sense that the money that SARS has collected is not enough to can be able to cater for all the government needs. At the end, government has to go out and borrow. And for now, debt is a problem, because government is spending more than 350 to 400 billion a year servicing debt, not to pay off the debt, because the debt is so high up to so far. So those are some of the critical issues that the minister will have to explain to the committee. How are they managing debt? Because it's a problem. How are they dealing with the issue of unemployment? How are they dealing with the issue of the economic growth? Because the solution is to grow the economy. So those are some of the critical issues that we'll be looking at and check as to whether the issues that is raising, are they funded in the budget.
You're still watching Parliament TV as we build up to the delivery of the 2025 budget speech by the Finance Minister, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, at 2 p.m. at the temporary chamber of the National Assembly, the New Minister Dome. And that was Dr. Maswanganyi answering a question with regards to the committee's contribution to reviewing, amending and initiating legislation related to the national budget. Now, we're still in conversation with Dr. Jantjies from the Parliamentary Budget Office. Doc, of course, we watched the chairperson as he responded to the committee's role in the contribution towards legislation, especially budget-related national legislation. With that now, he speaks to the medium-term development plan. And the last time that we spoke, we were speaking about how one of the concerns that the PBO had at the last engagements with the committees was how the medium term was not adopted. And now that it has been adopted, explain to us what the importance of the 5-year medium-term development plan is and how it shapes the budget.
No, thank you so much. You're correct that it's important to have, that's how we look at the budget, to say we need to have a clear development strategy in place. And it seems, as the chairperson was saying, the National Development Plan is still the mainstay of the whole process. I think the assumption that we've made is that because we haven't gotten touch of the actual MTDP, is that the State of Nation address we've seen in earlier by the President last month, it's overarching. It's really based on the mid-term development strategy. And our view has always been Parliament's analysis of the budget or adoption of budget should really use the MTDP as a lens to say, is this budget really talking to these issues? And that it's important in a way that otherwise, if we don't do that, in our view, there isn't going to be a good alignment. And we've argued with evidence over the years that there has always been divergence between the policy, strategic planning on one side and the budget framework on the other side. So we need to work towards a better convergence. And hence I said earlier on, it's important that Parliament see this budget, what you say in the paper, as a crucial budget. As the first budget term, it has to be aligned to the mid-term development targets. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to realize those, and it becomes similar to the NDP, where we've not realized a lot of, we've done much progress, but 5 years down the line, before the finishing line, we're still far behind in many of the targets of the NDP. And that is important, that Parliament is processing of the budget, it focuses a lot on it, and I agree with Dr. Maswanganyi in that interview as well.
And of course, then he speaks about unemployment, specifically youth unemployment. What are some of the key drivers of youth unemployment that your office has identified, and how can they be corrected?
That's a thesis question, the dissertation question. Look, I think one of the, we often take a step back because the bigger issue we have is our economy. Our economy is not absorbing more people in the economy. And the debate we've had over time is really around the structure of the economy. When you look at a lot of times, that's first, the structure of the economy definitely has changed, where we need to focus a lot on the more productive side of the economy. Have more secondary sector growing more than the service sector, which we see in our case, where we see a lot of service sector, which is not a bad thing, but I think you're not going to get more people absorbed if you don't have a lot of investment in manufacturing, a lot of investment in agricultural sector process, food processing, those where you can absorb people in big chunks of things. The second part, which we've also argued, and I sense that we'll see government, National Treasury agreeing to that, the lack of investment in the government. Because remember now, in our National Development Plan, we've set ourselves 10% target of 10% of GDP being reinvested in the economy by the public sector, which is government and state-owned entities. But over the past 10 years, we've barely reached 5% of it. And that, for me, a simple example, if you look at sector, let's say construction industry, it's likely to absorb less skilled people more. I'm very simplistic, but no, it's more complicated than that. But if government doesn't build more roads, doesn't invest more, whatever, then you'll have more of those young, energetic youth not getting absorbed by the sector, for example, and like agriculture. Another one's in our agriculture. If you're not getting better investments to ensure we modernize our agriculture sector, you're not going to be able to absorb less skilled employees, because the bulk of our unemployed, when you look at the way they are, the statistics, we have a lot of unskilled unemployed, and a lot of it's really, in our view, lack of the structure of the economy supports more technical or the service sector, which is good. It's not a bad thing, but it should be the other way around, where you have manufacturing being bigger and supporting services. Now we have a different.
The other way around.
The second part is lack of investment by even businesses or private sector as well. We have set ourselves 30%, all in all, of GDP must be invested. We've barely reached 20%. So that, for me, it's a big, big challenge. Unless we address those through the budget, through other mechanisms, we'll still be here next year.
And it's a conversation that we were having, that now things are different. That before, probably even before that I was born, that people that had the hand skills, were regarded the people that were almost important. When you say that you're going to a technical school, it was a thing. And now things have changed. Everybody wants to go to the traditional universities. Everybody wants to study to be an accountant, a lawyer. And maybe then Parliament can look at policies and trying to change that mind frame in people. Is that something maybe that we can look into as a country?
It's a good point, because when you look at a lot of support from the FET colleges, I don't know if they still call it, I think there's always been
TVET
yes,
now, yes.
I'm used to FET all the time. Sorry, I'm saying my age here. So a lot of investment has been tried to get more artisans in, as you say, in the space. But at the same time, as I say, the structure has to be able to absorb that of the economy. And I think there's strong evidence that structure is also a problem, because you're trying to move away from more of productive sectors. So that's also important. And I agree with you, Parliament has a bigger role to play.
Yes.
And we have to do it.
And then on Monday, 10th of March 2025, the chairpersons of the Finance Cluster held a pre-budget media briefing about Parliament's rigorous oversight and accountability role in ensuring that the national budget serves the needs of all the people of South Africa. Now, when asked about the country's economic status and the decisions that must be made, this is what Mr. Musi Maimane, the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance, had to say, on appropriations rather, had to say.
I don't want to sound alarmist, and perhaps I want to give credence to the finance ministers that have served this country in the manner that they have, with the conditions they've had, and almost in some ways, when I think about Minister Godongwana, recognize the fact that we are now heading to a point of significant crisis. That is a reality. We are no longer making choices that are good or bad. We are making choices that are worse or much worse. And that's where we are. We are at the peak of taxation. You can't tax citizens more, and I'm talking about personal income tax in this regard. Because after that point, you start to create tax morality issues, where citizens simply figure out ways to avoid tax. Wealthy people don't pay as much tax because, to Honorable Zibi's point, you figure out a way to externalize your wealth. So the 460,000 taxpayers who sit in the middle, those who do the majority of tax payments, are the ones that are going to feel the ultimate impact. So now we must think about what choice we're making to honor those citizens. That is and these are not straightforward choices. You are now at a point where I don't think it's sustainable for South Africa to think of the budget as an exercise in adjusting for inflation. It must now think of the budget as an exercise of going, what significant choices are we going to make? There's a lot of discussion about saving millions to achieve a reduction in billions. For example, it's easy for me to sit here and say, sure, reduce the cabinet, right? Except the reduction of the cabinet, even consistent with the previous special appropriation, is only in the hundreds of millions relative to the 57 billion rand shortfall that you would either get or not get by increasing VAT. So we really are at a point now where we have to make tough decisions. And so when the question is put from the floor, do I endorse a VAT hike or more borrowing? In my personal capacity, I certainly can't. Because there are also disproportionate impacts when you start to increase VAT. In fact, over the long period of time, impacts the poor. And as I've alluded earlier, once your bonds are rated in the manner that they are, increasing borrowing in that regard is not going to help.
You are still watching Parliament TV as we build up to the 2025 budget speech to be delivered by Minister Godongwana at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And that was Mr. Mose Maimane, the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations, talking about the difficult decisions that need to be made by the South African government and some of the consequences of the alternative measures that could possibly be implemented to increase South Africa's revenue capacity. I'm still joined by the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanke. It's a grim picture there painted by Mr. Maimane, but in your view, should we consider ourselves heading for a significant crisis considering the fiscal and financial climate that South Africa currently finds itself in?
Look, when we look at the brief that we did in the previous budget, in February, pre-brief.
The postponed one.
Yeah, postponed one. Okay. We did look at that debate around whether we're in a fiscal crisis or financial crisis, I don't know. But I think it largely was about debt. The debate has always been we're highly indebted and so on. So I think what we try to do is just to decompose it, to say the evidence doesn't really support that debate a lot when you look at the context where we are as a society, meaning that the debt to GDP ratio, for example, what we have certain debt to GDP ratio which is quite high. But when you look at the debt, we look at the composition of it to say how much of it we own it, how much of it is owned by foreigners, you know. But also going down further deeper down to say, do we have experience of defaulting on this over time? But also the profile of the debt itself. We have a very long-term profile, 50-year and maturity profile of that. So there are elements that says, generally when you look at other countries in a similar, almost similar status as us, many of them have quite a higher percentage of GDP. But also 90% of our debt, we own it, meaning it's in local currency. So we are somehow protected from any shocks that can come from the foreign currency. So look at Argentina, for example. It's a country where there has been a very interesting example where you talk about from the country in a fiscal crisis because they had so much defaults that they had. Since 1930, we've never had any default in South Africa because government has always protected, there's always been a haircut when it comes to debt. So in that way, we are arguing that let's have a very sober conversation around that. Yes, the debt is high to GDP ratio, but it's as high as lack of growth. If you grow the economy, that expands quite a lot of times. But like I say, when you decompose the debt that we have, it gives some level of assurance to say, as much as it's high, but we need to focus on growing the economy. Because you can spend your time and try to deal with debt, or you can spend your time growing the economy, which will be more long-term permanent a solution towards the issue of the crisis. You know, I don't want to sound that I'm debating but with the chairperson, but I'm just saying it's always good to go deeper into these discussions, particularly where we're sitting at the stage as a country in a first term. You know, we need to be really preoccupied with how we're going to grow the economy, create more employment, and budget is a very important tool to get us to that. And I feel, in our brief, Parliament has a powerful role to play in trying to drive us toward that area. And revenue is one area. And yes, in some instances, we'll have debt being part of the package on getting us towards that space of growth and employment.
And one of the issues that Mr. Maimane speaks about is, and raises it as a concern, is the issue of the bloated cabinet. And we know even previously that has been raised, even before the 7th Parliament, there has been outcry about us having such a huge cabinet. Now, when the president took over the 7th Parliament and became the president in the government of national unity, we saw an increase in cabinet again. Now, what are the financial consequences of this, rather? And are you of the view that decreasing cabinet could make a huge impact on the financial situation of South Africa?
We haven't done, I'll be frank, we have not done analysis specifically around that. But I think the way, what I will say to you is how we've looked at the debate around wage bill, because it's been debated, we've contributed towards it. And I think our approach is say, Parliament has to demand the productivity of that, to say, we're spending this much on the wage bill, how productive that is. And in a way, you are forcing government to ensure it's productive in how much it spends on wage bill. And I feel that debate, it's more, more positive to have, and I think Parliament can drive that to say, I spend 32% of the budget in wage bill, how much are we getting as value from that? Then show us proof efficiency and so many other things. So there's quite a good debate and good argument around efficiencies, which I agree with Mr. Maine in that context. But we have not done a very deep analysis about the cabinet as a whole. It's a very difficult one. But from wage bill perspective, which it touches on the cabinet as well, we think there has to be a debate about efficiency. Are we efficient? Are we productive with the amount that we spend in cabinet? And there's been a lot of discussion around this. One of the solutions to our budget problem is ensure efficiencies. But my concern around the debate around efficiency is that it shouldn't be seen as a solution. Efficiency will get you at most not more than 5 billion. Or I'm just being very overly optimistic here. We need way more than that. And some of the governance or deficiencies is part of the system, be part of bureaucracy. But we need to, it can't be, what I'm saying is we can't see there's a solution out of where we are. Yes, it can get us somewhere, but we need more than that. And we need to make sure the public service is able to deliver service. Because on one side, we have a serious shortage of service delivery. So when you try to target the public wage bill, you need to really deal with that dichotomy to say there's a huge concerns about poor service delivery. And on one side, you're spending money. If you cut it, what does it mean for service delivery? So that's what I'm saying. For me, it's better that debate in a way where you want value for money as Parliament.
Dr. Anjis, please allow me to thank you so much for always taking time out of your busy program to ensure that you are here with us at Parliament TV. It's really much appreciated.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, viewers, as well. Thanks so much.
Yes, that's still watching the live broadcast of Parliament TV as we build up to the 2025 budget speech to be tabled by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Godongwana, at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And as mentioned earlier, the budget was initially scheduled to take place on 19 February 2025. However, it was postponed due to disagreements in the cabinet, and the delays have prompted debates with Parliament and the broader society as to whether government has considered other revenue sources other than VAT, given its regressive nature of the consumption tax. After this, we speak to Mr. Matthew Parks, the parliamentary coordinator for COSATU, to get some insight on the expectations of the labour sector. Stay with us.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society, despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic, and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the Appropriation Bill and table the Division of Revenue Bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
Welcome back to our special live coverage of the 2025 budget speech here on Parliament TV. As we build up to the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana's much anticipated budget speech, we take a closer look at the role of the labor unions and their expectations from the Minister's speech later on at 2 p.m. today. Known as the largest labor union federation in South Africa, with a strong national and regional structure, the Congress of South African Trade Unions was established on December the 1st in 1985 in Durban after 4 years of negotiations between trade unions that opposed apartheid. COSATU includes many of the country's biggest unions, such as the National Union of Mine Workers, and right now we are joined by Mr. Matthew Parks, the Parliamentary Coordinator of COSATU. Good morning, Mr. Parks, and thank you very much for joining us at Parliament TV.
Good morning, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, sir. Just to kickstart this conversation, what are some of COSATU's expectations from the budget speech, and what are the key areas that you think the Minister of Finance should focus on?
I think a couple of things. One, we hope the government avoids the temptation to go to extreme options. We hope to move away from austerity budget cuts, which have really crippled the capacity of the state to provide the public services that workers, society, the economy depend upon. We hope to also avoid a temptation to increase VAT or income taxes upon the poor, the working class families who are already struggling to survive with the rising cost of living, who are drowning in debt. We think there's a need to kind of get the basics right. We need to capacitate the state, make sure it can provide the services that society and the economy depend upon to thrive. We need to stimulate the economy to make sure it moves from a 1% GDP growth rate to at least 3%. We need to also provide a pathway for people to find jobs. So we need to address those fundamental issues, because otherwise we can tinker on the sides. We're not going to address the fundamental cause of this crisis. It's not it's not an expenditure crisis, it's an economic growth crisis, which then impacts upon revenue. I think for us, there were so many good things in the initial budget that was meant to be tabled. It spoke to ramping up investments in infrastructure, which is going to help grow the economy. It spoke to giving support to public employment programs, to rebuilding our SOEs. It spoke to providing protection for the poor, the unemployed, through social grants, through other, extending the VAT basket of goods, which are exempt from VAT. So I think for us it's also about how do you capacitate the state. And again, the budget had many of those things about filling critical frontline vacancies like doctors and nurses, teachers, police officers and so forth, rebuilding the frontline services. So we hope we retain those, but we look for an alternative to a VAT hike, because we feel a VAT hike, it treats the poor the same as you treat the rich. Workers are already struggling to cope with inflation, and you squeeze them a bit more, it's very difficult for them to survive. So we hope that government can rather focus on empowering SARS to improve tax compliance. We have about 800 billion rand of taxes which are owed to the state. We don't think you need to go after new taxes, rather go and fetch that money which is already owed. So if we hope that government will take this in a calm manner. There's only a revenue shortfall of about 58 billion rand, and we have tabled as COSATU proposals where we think the money could be found in a way which doesn't hurt workers.
You mentioned a lot capacitation of the state, and we know that there has been outcries regarding the service that is provided by the public servants who happen to be, some of them who happen to be your members, which is members of COSATU. What do you think needs to be done in terms of capacitating the state? Does this mean that, is it capacitating the state as in like the executive, the people that are in charge, or does it also include even capacitation of the workers?
So first about capacity in the frontline services. So you can't, workers are frustrated when they go to home affairs. They may have to queue for 6 days. And the reason why is because there's a 60% vacancy rate. So there's long queues as a consequence. Where there should have been 10 staff, you've got 4 staff. So obviously the queues are going to be double. You also have an infrastructure capacity issue because the IT system is archaic, it's old, so it's constantly offline. So again, the queues are increased all the time. So if you fill the critical frontline vacancies, if you address the infrastructure issues, then you can improve the quality of services. So the government has shown with the South African Revenue Service that this is the path to rebuild the state. You appoint competent management, you remove corrupt criminal elements, you deal with the issue of corruption, you fill critical vacancies, you hire skilled staff, you invest in institutions, infrastructure capacity, and as a consequence, SARS has improved tax compliance from 61 to 64%. So apply the same model to Home Affairs, to the police, to education, to schools, to universities, to health, then you will see the benefits. And if we simply take it as well, this is a financial burden to the state, sure, there's a price tag you pay, but society reaps the rewards. And when society gets the benefits of efficient Home Affairs or an efficient hospital or schools, etc., the businesses also benefit too from the product, and that means they're able to grow, that means jobs will be created, and that means that the revenue that the state needs to fund it will come to it. So I think for us we must take a longer term approach and not just simply take it as an accounting approach.
Now, a burning issue currently in the country, we've seen marches or pickets conducted by unemployed graduates, in particular those who have obtained their medicine qualifications, and we've read reports of how inadequate the services are in our hospital, and yet we are sitting with a huge number of people that have graduated on a rare scale, because I would consider a doctor to be one of those skills. What do you think needs to be done? Because this is not painting a good picture for the country as well as for the civil servants.
Yeah. So look, in the budget that was meant to have been tabled, we hope that element will be retained. There was an allocation for additional funding for hospitals to do the infrastructure, the deterioration of the conditions there. There was also funding for 1,800 doctors to be appointed to address that issue, to appoint more nurses. So we hope they will retain those things, because workers need those services. You know, there's a disruption to life when people have to queue for 12 hours to get basic medication, and then people often then forego the treatment because they need to go to work. And then it means they get sick, it means the workplace gets disrupted, and so on. So we need to get the basics